top 5 movies of the 1980s. There's a couple of reasons why I'm really excited to do this list. One is because it was voted on by the Patreon subscribers. I know that I think this is the third top 5 list that I've done since the show launched, but it'll probably be once, maybe twice a month that I'll be doing a top 5 because I don't want to overkill the formula. But for once a month, I'm going to be putting up a poll on my Patreon. And if you're a subscriber, you get to vote on what the top 5 topic will be. So if you want to be a part of that, you can head over to patreon.com/featurepresspod for some other cool bonus content as well. You get bonus shows, you get ad-free and early access to the full podcast. You get other fun little nuggets as well. So head on over to patreon.com/featurepresspod for that. The second reason is because the 1980s is my favorite decade of movies. There are so many good movies to choose from, especially from that 84 to like 86, 87 range. There were so many great hits, so many successful movies, and launching points for franchises, some that are still relevant today, and some that have stood the test of time, even though they may have gotten a sequel or two that you might have went into the early 90s, but the 80s, you can make the argument when it comes to music and other pop culture events, as far as, what's better, the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s, whatever the case may be. The one that you can never debate to me is that the 80s have the best movies. And I grew up in the 90s, but going back and just looking at the library and then movies that I grew up with, most of them were from the 80s. So I have that sentimental attachment, even though I was born in 86, but I don't really remember the 80s. I remember a little bit of 89, but I call myself a 90s kid because I started to form my memories in the 90s. I remember most of the movies that came out, but either way, I'm saying the 80s is my favorite decade when it comes to movies. So this was a fun list to do. Of course, it was difficult, I feel like most of the top 5 lists are. I've got quite a few honorable mentions, and the way this works, if you've never listened to the top 5 list before, if you're listening to the show for the first time, or if you're watching this segment on YouTube, whenever I decide to do a top 5 list, I post a thread on Facebook saying it's going to be top 5, in this case, movies of the 80s. You leave your list in the comments below, and I'll read them on the show. So you leave them there. I'm going to go through my top 5, give a little bit of an explanation as to why they are where they are on my list, go through honorable mentions, and then I'll read the listeners' list as well. So let's get things kicked off with my number 5, and that is the John Hughes classic, The Breakfast Club. I remember watching this movie in high school. My friend Jamie Hammond introduced me to it, and I think it was one of the first movies I remember that I really started to notice the storytelling of movies. It was made in the mid-'80s. It has to do with high school and high school detention and kids from different cliques and different backgrounds all kind of bonding. And I always thought that was really cool. And, I love Emilio Estevez in his role as the jock. Of course, Anthony Michael Hall, other characters as well. Just a fun movie to sit down and watch. And if you've never seen it, I would highly recommend it. It's got a great story, some cool actors, the acting's great in it, and it's very quotable. It's a very quotable movie, and the soundtrack's great too, as are most of the movies on this list. My number 4 is the original Tim Burton Batman, released in 1989, starring Michael Keaton as Bruce Wayne / Batman, and of course Jack Nicholson as the Joker. I was 3 when this movie came out. It was the summer of 89, so I would have been, I would have been 3 years old. Sorry, math is not my strongest subject. But I remember watching this movie on VHS, for those of you who might remember what that is, at my uncle's house. And I distinctly remember there being an advertisement at the beginning of the movie with Bugs Bunny and Daffy Duck about how you could send in this mail order to get a catalog. And with the catalog, you could order Batman merchandise that you couldn't really get anywhere else. I never did that, but I thought that was really cool. The movie itself is great. It's one of those movies that, and you'll hear me say this a lot on this and future episodes of the show, that I appreciate more as I've gotten older. I actually really like Michael Keaton's take on Batman. I think he plays both Batman and Bruce Wayne particularly well. I like Jack Nicholson's take on the Joker because when I think of the Joker, I think of him being a member of the mob. Heath Ledger's incarnation of the Joker is totally different. So was Jared Leto's, Joaquin Phoenix. Everybody plays the Joker a little different. But I liked the, sort of unstable that you see in all qualities of the Joker, incarnations of the Joker. But I did like that little bit of silliness to it. I specifically remember the scene when he and the rest of his goons are going through the art gallery and repainting all the pictures, and with Prince's Party Man playing in the background. It's another great soundtrack too. People forget that Prince did the soundtrack for a Batman movie, but it's great. I have it on my Spotify account. I listen to it every now and then. It's great. But I love the Tim Burton Batman. It's a movie that I can just plug in and watch whenever I want. And I do plan on doing a watch along for that movie at some point this year. My number 3 is Top Gun. When I think of fun summer blockbusters, this is the first movie I think of. I remember watching it again on VHS at my grandparents' house when I was a kid. And I thought the flight scenes were cool. It made me interested in learning more about, planes and the military. And of course, Tom Cruise was my favorite actor at the time. So obviously I was going to be in love with it. I'm really excited for the sequel. But to me, this movie screams 1980s. But I still enjoy it. It's just a fun movie. I can just turn it on, switch my brain off, and enjoy the ride. My number 2 is Back to the Future, and this has become one of my favorite movies of all time, not just from the 80s, but it's right in that cusp of the peak of 1980s movie culture to me. Everything with having such a relatable story with a kid going back in time and seeing that his parents went through a lot of the same struggles that he did. And the infamous Marty and George McFly interaction. Love Christopher Lloyd as Doc Brown. Another great soundtrack. I have it on CD, actually, with, of course, Huey Lewis and the News, Eric Clapton, some other great 80s songs as well. And of course, if you want to take it back to the 50s, you have Earth Angel on there too, but that's another story. Love Back to the Future. It's funny. I think the script is amazing. One of the best written scripts that I think has ever been written. I love it. It's just such a fantastic, phenomenal movie, and has a number of great quotes as well. It's one of those movies that will stand the test of time. It will still be talked about when I'm gone and most everyone who's watching this video are gone. But my number 1, and it's kind of ad nauseum, but it's The Empire Strikes Back. Star Wars Episode 5, my favorite movie of all time, came out the summer of 1980. What can you not say about it, or what can you say about it that hasn't been said before? It's, to me, one of those perfect movies. It took the foundation of A New Hope, and it just blasted Star Wars into the stratosphere, more so than it already had, because the storytelling was better, the fights were better, the ship fights were better, the on-planet battles were better, you were introduced to Yoda, you had the best movie twist of all time, in my opinion. Just a great movie, and it took characters that we already loved from A New Hope and just took them to the next level with better character development. And obviously the script was better, the directing was better. It was just a better movie than A New Hope. So that's easily my number 1. But my honorable mentions, we have Back to the Future Part 2, Star Wars Episode 6, Return of the Jedi, Ghostbusters. If this were a top 10, Ghostbusters would have been my number 6. But Breakfast Club just barely beat it out for me. Rocky 3, I mentioned this in the top 5 movie sequels. From a fun standpoint, it's my favorite Rocky movie because I love watching Mr. T just be Mr. T and do Mr. T things. I loved the fall from grace that Rocky had and then turning to his old rival Apollo Creed to get back to the championship. And then, of course, I had to throw the Karate Kid in there because without Karate Kid, we wouldn't have Cobra Kai. And don't get me wrong, I really like the original Karate Kid movie and its sequels. Despite the flaws of the third one, I do enjoy watching it because of Terry Silver. But without the Karate Kid, we wouldn't have Cobra Kai. So I had to throw that on there. And who doesn't enjoy watching Mr. Miyagi? So now we're going to move on to our other list here. We have one of our Patreon subscribers, one of the voters who made this list possible, Mr. Mike Eveland of B-Res Coffee. See, Indiana Jones, and I believe he means The Last Crusade, because I know he mentioned it on Twitter a couple of days ago. So I'm going to assume that that's the one he's talking about. Ghostbusters, Top Gun, Star Wars. I'm curious as to which one he's talking about, and Willow. And he mentions as an honorable mention, Die Hard. Steve Wise, Raiders of the Lost Ark, another great movie. E.T., The Wrath of Khan, which is Star Trek II. Aliens, and The Empire Strikes Back. Carlos Longoria, number 5, Predator. 4, The Princess Bride. 3, Goonies, another classic. 2, Ghostbusters, and number 1, Back to the Future. His honorable mentions are RoboCop, Spaceballs. I forgot about Spaceballs. I love that movie. And for some reason, people think that I would hate Spaceballs because it's a parody of Star Wars. But I love it. It's so funny. If you've never watched Spaceballs, do yourself a favor. After you finish this portion of the podcast, go watch Spaceballs. It is hilarious. My favorite Mel Brooks movie. And that's saying a lot because he's made a lot of great movies. Aliens, Willow, Do the Right Thing, and The Breakfast Club. Jonathan McIntosh, his number 5 is The Terminator. 4, Ghostbusters. Terminator would be an honorable mention for me as well. 3, Raiders of the Lost Ark. 2, Back to the Future. And number 1, The Empire Strikes Back. His honorable mentions are Highlander, There Can Only Be One, Top Gun, Airplane, Goonies, Silverado, and I'm Gonna Get You, Sucka. Wade Vatican, his number 5 is Return of the Jedi. 4, Batman. 3, Stand By Me, another great movie. 2, Ghostbusters. And number 1, The Karate Kid. And he says as a note, it's the best around. And Cobra Kai has been sweeping legs since 1984. He and I are both big Cobra Kai fans. Love talking Cobra Kai with Wade. His honorable mentions, The Goonies, Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. He also mentions Junior in the Sean Connery voice, which I'm not very good at. Rain Man and The Empire Strikes Back. Jacob Craig, number 5, Uncle Buck. 4, Raiders of the Lost Ark. 3, The Terminator. 2, Batman. And number 1, Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. And last but not least, Mr. Brandon Rutledge. There are so many to list, and I'm probably going to forget something. Number 5, Spaceballs. 4, Star Wars Episode 6, Return of the Jedi. 3, Back to the Future and Back to the Future Part 2. 2, Oliver and Company. Very underrated Disney movie and has one of my favorite Disney songs. Look up Why Should I Worry by Billy Joel. You won't regret it. And number 1, Star Wars Episode 5, The Empire Strikes Back. And his honorable mentions are the Indiana Jones trilogy, The Fox and the Hound, The Great Mouse Detective, Ghostbusters, The Karate Kid, Highlander, and The Princess Bride. So that's going to do it for top 5 movies of the 1980s. This was a really fun list to do. Best decade of movies, as I mentioned at the beginning. Would love to do maybe movies of the 70s at some point. That would actually be really fun because there's some great movies from the 70s too. But be on the lookout for the next top 5, probably coming up around the end of February. So just stay tuned to facebook.com/featureprezpod, and you'll find out when we're going to do the next top 5 list.